We are live, everyone, with another episode of the Trainman Report. Oh, I hear myself. Okay, there, I muted the stream. We are here. We have Guy Rodgers with us. We have Alexander Montagano himself, the Trainman Report. Also, if you do need some good repairs done in the neighborhood, some work on your house, just so you know, Trainman's good. He's good with his hands, is what I understand.
Another plug.
We appreciate all of you being here today, watching live across the different platforms out there. Make sure to subscribe. Make sure to tell your friends and let them know that we're trying to be the super local NDG news source place that covers the stuff that no one else talks about because it's just an NDG. And thus, with the limited pool of NDGness, we need your help to share it with the folk in the neighborhood. And we would appreciate that as we look into building out some cool stuff for you over on Patreon, some extra content. We're trying to get Alex to do some young people stuff. We're working on them. It's an in progress situation. And then we're going to evolve.
What's that?
We're going to make you hipper in this situation, help you be out there and do what you do, but shine in a new light. And if y'all want to see that journey, you can support the Trainman Report as we grow this out. But today, we have a very special guest with us, Mr. Guy Rodgers. Now, Alex, he likes to come through with his super polished introduction. So without further ado, Alex, take it away.
Thank you so much, Holden. And I have to give a shout out to Holden, who hosts these podcasts and does just an awesome job. So thank you very much. Yes, very, very excited to have Guy Rex Rodgers on the show, who I want to call Guy all the time because that was my grandfather's middle name, but he goes by Guy, so we'll call him Guy. And very, very excited for a variety of different reasons. Because he is the director, producer, and writer, stop me if I'm wrong, of What We Choose to Remember. And it's kind of a historical documentary on the Anglophone, Allophone experience in Quebec. Specifically, I would say more Montreal-wise, but you do talk about Anglophone communities throughout Quebec and their experience and how they've kind of lived through the last 50 years since the FLQ crisis. And what really excites me, which I'm tickled pink about, is not only is it just an amazing film that everybody should watch, I just watched it today again for the second time and just was blown away by, the sincerity of it, the people talking about really their personal experience living through the last 50 years in Quebec. And what makes it exciting for me personally is that Guy, I did it. You see, I almost did it. Guy Rex Rodgers.
He's actually fine.
Guy Rex Rodgers has agreed to do a screening here of his film in NEG, and we're having that screening the 25th of April at 7 p.m. and everybody's invited. And right now I'm in a mode of promoting it, and very excited about that. I'm going to talk about that, and I just want to talk to pass the ball, I guess, to Guy, not Guy. I have a really tough time with it. I'm sorry. And just how does that kind of I have so much questions to ask you, and I guess the first question is, what inspired you initially to do this film? What was the inspiration, the epiphany that led you down a road to create this film?
Well, there are kind of two answers. I mean, when people used to ask Leonard Cohen how long it took him to write a poem, he'd say, well, you had the time I actually spent sitting on this piece of paper or the decades that went into learning how to write poetry. So I've been working on this particular film since 2020, when money became available. It was the 50th anniversary of the FLQ crisis. So there's an entire process of making the film. But I had been thinking about the film and the stories in the film ever since I arrived in Quebec in 1980.
Oh, wow.
I actually was born in Canada, but my family moved to Australia when I was 12. So I grew up in Australia, knew little about Canada, knew nothing about Quebec. I was actually heading to Berlin in 1980, but in Vancouver, there was an ad in the Vancouver Sun for a brand new playwriting course at the National Theatre School of Canada. I wrote a play, and I was accepted in Montreal. So from the very first day I arrived here, that was the year of the first referendum, the tension, the complexity, the niceness of the people one-on-one, and yet the hostilities between tribes, it was fascinating. I mean, the second weekend I was here, I went out to try to meet somebody outside the theater school, and I wandered around downtown Montreal with my book, French for Beginners, and sitting at Place Ville-Marie at the end of the afternoon after a long day of non-responsiveness, a little voice said, "T'as pas froid, pas de souliers?" Because I was wandering around Montreal in September barefoot because I was a hippie who'd lived on a beach in Australia. And that's how I met my wife. And so, we've been together ever since. So she introduced me to the Francophone community, taught me French. And so I've observed both communities, have loved both communities, which is the case of a lot of people. And so when the money came available in 2020, I wanted to record the eyewitnesses of that half century. The people who are the eyewitnesses who lived in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. I wouldn't call them old, but it's better to get them now than to try in 25 years or 50 years. So I wanted to capture that at this moment. I also wanted to make a film that paid tribute to the English-speaking communities of Quebec. How hard they've tried to sort of adapt, to adjust, to be good citizens in Quebec. And the third reason for making the film was to engage in a dialogue with our Francophone neighbors, to say, come on, some of your stereotypes about Anglos are decades, maybe centuries out of date. And I'm happy that you noted that the people in the film are sincere, they're authentic, they love Quebec, they come with their own problems and challenges, they're working through them. But the response to the film has been extraordinary because, people just identify with it, whether they're Anglos, Allophones, or even Francophones. And we might talk about that more later, the Francophone response, which is the most complex, but in some ways the most interesting.
Yeah, I can see that. And when I'm watching the film, I'm thinking to myself, well, Francois Legault should be seeing this. Valerie Plante should be watching this movie.
Well, Aaron Rand said that when the film came out. He said,
Right.
Francois Legault has got to see this film.
Yeah, and I think that the kind of like the humanity of your movie and how you're talking to people one-on-one and they're sharing their personal stories. That brings a lot of value, right? In the sense that you're talking about a person's life and how they've tried to like adapt to the current political environment in Quebec, and they're looking for their own place in this world as well, right? And but I guess I want to follow up on like, okay, I asked you the question, why did you create the film? But what's very interesting as well is the way you're managing the screenings. The screenings, from what I hear, are it's not just about seeing the film, it's about a community conversation. So could you talk to that a little bit?
Well, let me just back that up one phase, because probably a lot of your listeners have not seen the film, know nothing about it. So when I started trying to make the film,
I saw your trailer, the one that you put on YouTube. That like is 17 minutes long, which I felt is a sample of what the movie's like.
It is. It's a fairly representative sample. But when I started trying to think of how to make a film representing a community or communities of more than 1 million people, who do you pick? You.
Right. Yeah, I was offended you didn't pick me. I was really upset about that.
I'm also always available if you want me in your movies, people out there.
But do you choose people based on their ethnicity, their religion? We eventually came across the idea of making it a story of immigration based upon waves of immigration.
Right.
Because when you arrive in Quebec, there's a socio-economic, cultural, historical vibe that's going on. So everybody who arrived at the same time kind of experienced that. And a family that's been here like 250 years has a different relationship to Quebec than a family that's been here 10 years or 5 years. So once we hit upon the idea of waves of immigration, then it was a matter of recruiting people who represented the main immigration groups in those periods. And I filmed them as groups, because I wanted them to be accountable to their families, to their relatives, to their communities. So instead of just somebody chatting off the cuff one-on-one, they were in a room with other people who'd arrived during that period. And then they would inspire one another, go, oh yeah, that's right. And they would talk about things that had been handed down to them by their parents and their grandparents. And the beauty of doing the interviews in a room full of people was that they got involved in this conversation with friends and peers, and they forgot about the cameras. They forgot about the microphones. And that's one of the reasons why they come across as being so natural and so spontaneous.
Right.
You know, you can't get that effect when somebody's got a microphone and a camera stuck in their face and they're being grilled. You know, they can't relax easily.
Right.
Right.
I hear you.
All of that to be said, that from the beginning, the idea was a group conversation based upon our various relationships to Quebec, our sense of identity, and our sense of belonging. So every screening, and there's been more than 40 so far, I've been in every region of Quebec, the North Shore, you know, Baie-Comeau, Sept-Îles, many times in West Quebec, Gaspé twice, Magdalen Islands, all over. And after every screening, I just open the floor to the people in the room, and I say, you can ask me questions. You can comment on the film, but I'm really interested in hearing, you know, why your family came to Quebec.
Love
if
it.
there was ever a temptation to leave Quebec, why you
Yeah.
chose to stay. Did part of your family leave? Did part of them stay? And then the $1 million question is, how are you feeling about Quebec now?
Right.
When I was making the film in 2020, you know, Bill 96 was just a little tiny cloud on the horizon.
Yeah.
By the time I was finishing the editing and getting ready to release the film in 2022, we kind of knew where it was going, but it was still under debate in the National Assembly, so we weren't absolutely sure. But at every screening, and increasingly over the last 2 years, you know, Bill 96, Bill 21,
Yeah.
they're on people's minds, and they want to talk about how they're feeling.
A lot of dark
And so
clouds.
just to the people out there, those are the current wave of government legislation that is suppressing English rights in Quebec that passed recently. So basically, over the course of creating the film, the legal process took place, and as the film's being screened, it's a live thing that people are now living with the consequences of. As we once touched on in a ludicrous example, a swimming pool got in trouble for English safety instructions and was not allowed to in NDG. So like, it really does
an
have
English neighborhood, I should point out.
real life applications on some ridiculous levels. Whether or not stores should be allowed to have signs is different. That's a whole other game. When we're talking about safety instructions, fuck your language politics, you know? But I have a question about the documentary process, right? Because you kind of said you landed on this group discussion thing, but you also said that it was kind of a lengthy conceptualization period. So given that documentaries can take so many different forms, how did you land on this version of interview conversationalism? Was that how you always pictured it, or was that something that kind of came once you clicked on the waves of immigration idea?
Well, let me put this in a larger context. I mean, originally, I had a relatively small amount of money to do a project about identity and belonging. It wasn't necessarily a documentary project. I mean, my background is in screenwriting and filmmaking, so I chose to go in that direction, but I could have just, you know, had group conversations or had done some artwork. So I got the concept for the waves of immigration, the 5 groups, the 5 waves, plus a 6th group representing people in the regions. And that's an important part of the film, because not all Anglos live in Montreal, and that history outside Quebec is very important. So once I had the original idea of filming them, we brought people into a room. I asked them a lot of questions. They talked, we filmed, we made some short documentaries. That was the end of the project. There was no budget for promotion. There was no distribution plan. But those short films resonated so strongly and immediately that people said, no, you've got to do more. And I had 20 hours of very interesting footage that I hadn't used. So the first partner that came on board was MaTV. So for those who are not familiar with MaTV, that's the community division of Videotron in Quebec. And they said, we would love you to turn these 6 little documentaries into half-hour episodes of a 6-part TV series. So they gave me some money to expand them all to a standard 30 minutes. So I did that. And then they gave me an additional amount of money to subtitle them and to broadcast them in the French version. Then CBC gave me some money to do a slightly varied version for them that was broadcast on CBC a couple of years ago and is still available on Gen. And then the National Film Board said this would make a great feature-length documentary. So I had the interviews, although in some cases, things people said were so intriguing that I brought them back and had them get the same haircut and wear the same clothes and I did some additional interviewings too,
That's
especially about the
amazing.
FLQ crisis and about the 95 referendum. And then for the film, there's a lot of additional added value. I mean, I had everybody give me their family portraits. So when they're talking about their ancestors and their families, we show the pictures on the screen. There's some graphs, there's some maps. I mean, Alex is going to show us a graphic later on. It's
Hold
pretty.
on. I think we need to just pause. Guy, I like you, Guy. You are one of those mile a minute dudes. But sometimes what happens is people say really profound things and they gloss over them, which you kind of did there. You just outlined how to get funding for a documentary project really quickly, and I want to just kind of stop and highlight that because I think it's really interesting. And I'm part of the board of directors in Notre Dame des Arts, and we're looking into ways to represent language minority groups. And so literally earlier today I was looking at this grant that exists, and something that I think a lot of English speakers don't know is how much grant and funding opportunities exist for English arts because we're actually a minority group. Thus, all the minority stuff that exists does apply to us. We just don't look into it. And you brought up three major groups of people that found small samples of the work you created in English, and they said, this is fire. We're going to invest in this to grow it bigger. And so it's important that people see.
I guess that's a call to local NDG artists, is it not? There, Holden, is this your point?
Yeah,
here?
but it's the point is that create the samples, start your project, work with what you have, which is what you did, and after that it'll upscale if you have something quality there, because there is a lot of people looking to fund English culture, believe it or not. And I think that your movie is an example of that, despite the topic and the subject matter and the cultural dissonance that does exist here. There are, weirdly enough, all big portions of Quebec's government that will throw money at English stuff. It's just other parts of the government that we have problems with.
Mm-hmm. Well, I should mention, because you make a good point. I mean, when I graduated from theater school quite a few years ago, the cultural scene in Quebec was pretty much devastated. We were at the end of an exodus. A lot of institutions had collapsed. There were very few that were thriving. There was this redundant Quebec Drama Festival, which was created by the Dominion Drama Festival in 1932 by the Governor General, when people in Westmount wanted to get dressed in fancy clothes and pretend they were Noel Coward. By the 70s, it was totally redundant. So I got together with some other people, did a hostile takeover, and converted it into the Quebec Drama Federation.
Hostile takeover?
Hostile takeover. The founding board was not crazy about the way we did it. But there was funding, small amount of funding at that point from what was then the Secretary of State, which is now the Department of Canadian Heritage. And then because I had studied playwriting at the National Theatre School, I had friends who were novelists and poets, and they said, can you help us create an organization for writers? So I created the Quebec Writers Federation and was the founding president. And just this last fall, I was the host of their 25th anniversary award ceremony. But then 20 years ago, with a lot of funding available for English language arts that nobody knew about, or English language culture, I created the English Language Arts Network, which is now a multi-million-dollar organization. So, I've been aware of these non-regular.
Y'all were extremely the English language. I got to give props to the English Language Arts Network. That's ELAN, and it just clicked that that's what that is. I had a whole meeting with them to discuss potential cultural grants with the not-for-profit, because they offer services like, hooking not-for-profits up with information we don't know anything about. And like, I found out that the Ministry of Housing has culture grants, and like nobody knew that. And I've never heard a human being mention that in my life. So that is actually a very valuable resource that is available to people in Quebec. And if you are an English language person looking to pursue stuff, like, you kind of owe this man a lot of respect, because he's done a lot to help you. I just want to emphasize that.
All right, so guys,
I think for opportunities. When I sense there's a need and there's a funding source, I bring them together and magic happens.
Beautiful.
Excellent.
I know, Alex, it's not fully on your agenda, but it's still praise needing to be given.
Oh, yeah, Alex.
We're giving praise. No, it's all good. I really think there's a value in this conversation, because, there's call it what you want, Anglophone community in Montreal. we're very diverse, as your film points out, and it's a culture. And I really think that it needs to be celebrated. And we are part of the fabric, the social fabric that makes up Montreal and Quebec. And we have a lot to contribute, and we have contributed in significant ways already in terms of art and the various forms that art takes. And I think that we continue to we can continue to make a significant contribution. And we're very unique in our role or our position within Quebec right now. I think we have really interesting stories to say. But back on your movie, okay, because that can open a whole can of worms, that conversation I just had. What I
That's
noticed
good
about your
stuff.
what I noticed about your movie, and which really hit a nerve with me, is that um, you use the Montreal flag as kind of the front and center symbol of it. And yeah, and I guess I kind of giving the movie away a little bit, but I want to ask you why you decided to use the Montreal flag as sort of like the symbol of the movie, the film.
Well, there was one technical reason.
Hmm.
I had 20 hours of talking heads against black curtains. And so I didn't want the entire movie to be that. So I
Right,
wanted to start off with something lighthearted, out in the open. So I did a bunch of street interviews.
right,
But over the years, I've been testing this theory that Montrealers do not have any idea what the emblems are on their flag. And I wanted to
right.
test it just to show, because the title of the movie is What We Choose to Remember. And
Yes,
if we live in Montreal and we have this flag that's been around since the 1830s,
right,
and most Montrealers don't know what the emblems represent, that's
right.
kind of interesting. So that makes it
It
an
is.
interesting way to kick off the film. So if you look at it, in 1830, there was the rose
Yes.
representing
The English.
English. There's the shamrock representing.
Yeah, I'm
Oh
part
yeah.
Irish, so I know what
There's
that
the
means.
thistle representing.
The Scots.
But in 1830 until 1939, there was not a fleur de lis.
There wasn't.
There wasn't. It was quite recently added. So do you know what was representing the French-speaking communities of Montreal for the first 100 years?
Oh, let me
No.
think. Oh, that's a good question. I don't
Yeah.
know that. I don't know the answer to that question.
It was a beaver, because the beaver was the motor of the
La
economy for
Castor,
many years.
the beaver trade,
Amazing.
where les courriers de bois.
And it was
Yes,
only in the 1930s that Montreal figured that that was
these
so
habitants.
redundant that they and also, just as a sidebar, after the French Revolution,
Wow.
when France went Republican, they went secular. Denis Diderot is quoted as saying that men will be free when the last king has been strangled with the entrails of the last priest. And so Quebec, Nouvelle France went totally inward. They were not Republican. They were not secular. They became very religious.
Right.
It's only like many, many, many years later, in the 1930s, when there was this beginning to reconnect with the French, European history. So the Montreal flag was adapted, and then a few years later, Quebec created the fleur de lis flag. So that was all part of a cultural moment that was going on there.
That is an incredibly interesting story. Yeah. And then obviously the white pine was added to represent the First Nations.
Yeah, that's very recent. That was
Yeah,
like
very
2018.
recent. Yeah, your
2018,
flag's
yeah.
upside down there, Guy.
Oh,
Guy.
sorry.
Yeah, but yeah, but I really love it, and I have my own little personal story with one of the emblems, the Scottish thistle. I was as Holden earlier in the podcast gave me a free plug for my I'm a contractor, and I was digging up an old NDG house, and when I was digging up the old NDG house, I found one of these disposable clay pipes. You ever seen one of these things? It was like a pipe with a long stem, and they would smoke
Yeah.
it, and they would snap it off, and it was like, I think it was a one-time use pipe. It had tobacco. And it was actually, no, it was, I stand corrected. It was a one-time use clay pipe. They put tobacco in it. You would smoke it, and you would throw it away after. And it had an Irish thistle on it. And I actually did a lot of work researching it online, and that's how I discovered that it was a Scottish company, and it was imported from England, but it was operated and managed by the Scots, and the thistle represented the Scots, and they were a big part of Montreal's early economy when the English obviously conquered the French on the plains of Abraham, and Montreal became an important economic and commercial hub, right? Shipping hub,
Very big.
especially with the Lachine Canal.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. I really liked that, how you brought the flag in, and And yeah, I study politics, and I like to consider myself as somebody who follows the news, and I'll ingratiate myself a little bit and say I consider myself well read, and I am. There are times I'm kind of shocked at the lack of knowledge on basic kind of like things like people don't know what that even the flag is the flag of Montreal, and it's shocking.
Or Quebec's motto, Je me souviens.
Yeah.
There's a funny little scene in the film where I ask people about that. And of course, it doesn't mean anything. It was just adopted at one point because it's highly evocative and it sort of harkens back to the past, but it doesn't really mean anything.
Yeah, but I like how, we have Je me souviens. It was used as a way of like remembering the French kind of like place in Quebec, that they were the first ones who arrived here. It's a very politically loaded,
Totally.
motto.
Like,
and I like
I
how
don't
you
think-
kind of appropriated that for the English community. It's almost like what we choose to remember, but it's
Exactly.
like, I remember, right? Like there's a history to be remembered there as well from our side of the community. And I kind of like that like that kind of like play, that irony. It's really like interesting, right? And I think that
we should all be able to share our history. We should be able to share the flag, and we should be able to share the motto.
and we should all be able to celebrate together, right? I like it. It's like how you get these marginalized groups who appropriate the language that's used to insult them, right?
Be proud of it.
So like, is like the idea that we should be repping the Montreal flag? Because I'll be honest, most cities don't care about city flags in 2024. It's not really a Montreal thing. That's like I follow some YouTubers that actually do follow flag trends, and it's very niche that anyone cares about the symbols on flags beyond the federal level. Even at a provincial level, many people don't care that deeply. Like most people couldn't identify most other provinces' flags at this point. Like I could not tell you what Ontario's flag looks like. So, and then like, because when Alex asked the question, I'm like, I don't remember at any given point in my life that anyone's just talked about Montreal's flag ever.
Well,
It just
I
never
actually
came
think that's a problem there, Holden.
That is kind of a problem. If you have it and it's your history, you should talk about it.
Yeah, you're talking to some old timers right now. Like
Yeah.
No, but I
symbolism,
mean, it's just
symbolism
like,
is important, right? Because that defines to a
but
certain
then
extent
you have
what we
to ask
are,
the
right?
question, why didn't our parents talk to us about the flag ever? Like I talked about Canada's flag a lot, but never Montreal's flag.
I'll let
like,
Guy Rex Rodgers answer that one.
Well, I've talked to a lot of different people, and it really depends on how old you are. Older
I'm
people
36
are much
personally.
more inclined to have known what the symbols of the flag were. So I think somehow the education system in the 50s and 60s and even the 70s was more inclined to talk about the flag, and the people who are educated after that are much less likely to know about it.
Yeah, it just never came out much.
I think I'm gonna be jaded and say that the reason why we don't have a conversation or have public conversations about the Montreal flag, especially from the powers that be, is because it draws attention to the fact that Montreal is not this kind of like unilingual French creation.
It's such a universal thing that like, because it's not just a Montreal thing. It's pretty much every major city in North America could not tell you what the symbols on their flag mean for the most part. Often,
yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, it's a good point. I have no idea what New York City's flag looks like.
But hold on, I think
does Toronto have a flag? I've never seen Toronto's flag.
I'm not trying to be contrarian here. It's just an interesting topic.
But I think one of the differences in Quebec is that, as Alex says, the flag is ignored because of its political implications, certainly among a lot of Francophones, just not touched. Whereas in most cities, and New York is a good example, they are aware of the fact that it's a city of immigrants. And if you were to look at Montreal, just factually, look at the architecture of Montreal, the number of buildings that predate the so-called conquest of 1760, there's a handful of them. So what that means is that the subsequent people who arrived in Quebec, the waves of immigration, were partners and collaborators in building the modern Montreal. We didn't arrive one minute and try to steal it. We helped build it. I use the we in a big way because my family was not here, but But we being the non-Francophone, Italians, Greeks, Anglos, I mean, there's a history there, and it's not like we deserve it more, we have a bigger share. It's like, why can't we just acknowledge the fact that we worked on it together, and that we could be proud of it together?
I will go a step further and say that immigrants, this city was built on the backs of immigrants. I'm the son of a, I'm mixed, right? I'm a French, Irish, Italian, and what I see or what I know from Montreal history is that the immigrants who came over were the laborers. That's the Irish that built the Lachine Canal. It was the Italians that laid the cobble streets in the city of Montreal. It was the Chinese that built the railway, right? I could go on,
And
right?
the Black Porters who worked on the railway.
Exactly. And I really, these immigrant ways of immigrations, these immigrants that came in here came to work, and they came to work hard, and that's what they did. And we owe a lot to them. And everybody had a role to play, like you said. And I think we need to celebrate that. And I think the flag, unfortunately, it has only 5 emblems. There could be a lot more added to that. But yeah, I think that it's enough to say, look, it was a collective project, right?
From the
Everybody,
beginning.
yes, exactly. It doesn't necessitate the addition of like the Italians, the Greeks, the Filipinos. I could go on and on. The Haitians, the Polish. I'm sure I'm missing, for sure I'm missing like so many
Tons.
people,
Oh, yeah.
right? And I apologize if I didn't, name a nationality. But it really is a collective project. So, and I like one of the things that I don't want to spend too much time on this diversion here, but one of the things that I've learned through just model railway and doing a model of Lachine Canal was how interconnected everything is and how people were all working collectively on that project. All right, so we talked about that. So one of the on the agenda is Montreal's past more diversified than what our current political masters want us to believe. I think I put that, it's kind of a loaded statement in the agenda, but I kind of feel
It's a little loaded statement. I'm like, I've never heard that.
I think it's a reality. I think that and one of the things that comes up in your film is this kind of like someone talks about how the English names of things are disappearing and being replaced. And we see that in the city of Montreal. There's kind of this revisionist history going on, right? And, I'm kind of jumping ahead in terms of
Well,
the
I just like to
topics.
interject one thing there, Alex.
What's that? Go ahead, please.
We could spend a lot of time talking about this, but even prior to the so-called conquest,
Mhm.
when Nouvelle France was French,
Mhm.
many of the people who came from France did not speak French. They were speaking regional languages. So even then, there was an extraordinary amount of diversity. And we always think of the French arrivals as being all Catholic, but there was a large contingent of Huguenots. People like Roberval were unwelcome in France, but they were accepted in Nouvelle France. So even from the beginning, there was diversity of language, diversity of religion. There were collaborations with the indigenous people. So even before the arrival of the others, it was already far more diverse, because we're sort of taught that it was Catholic and French, and then the English Protestants arrived. And one thing that I try to show in the film is this notion of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. You know how hard it was to find somebody who self-identified as a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant? I mean, the closest they would come is say, I'm Protestant, but I'm Celtic. I'm not an Anglo-Saxon. I'm not a WASP. So
I met one in IKEA, and I posted online about it because it was such a special event for me.
It was really hard to find anybody who self-identified as a WASP. And so that idea that there's this group out there who are all this elite white Anglo-Saxon Protestants,
right?
It's just nonsense.
Yeah, it's delusional, and your movie, it busts those myths, and I think it does an excellent job at that. Yeah, Holden, I really getting the energy that you want to jump in and say something here.
No, I'm just like, because like I go through my own version of it, right? Because like there's this over 40 version of language divide, and then there's this under 40 version that's really different, because most of the young Quebecers that I encounter speak English pretty well. And I think like it's not Like the youth are not perpetuating the same stereotypes. Now, many of them will admit to going through a radicalized phase of hating Anglophones, but then they get on the internet and like you can't hide the truth from like people who are looking for it. And they realize how messed up our government policy is compared to other places, and their eyes become opened as they go party and meet English people all over the city. And it's often partying that brings the groups together, in my experience. And so I don't ever encounter a lot of the stuff that I hear from older generations very often, except for when I'm talking to older people. But then I recognize that the political system is completely derived of older people making policies based off of older prejudices, because unfortunately the voting curve is older. And it's just sometimes interesting to listen to a lot of the struggles people face, considering as an English Montrealer, I don't encounter none of it. Even at work, I've never encountered half the obstacles that I hear exist for other people. So,
Yeah,
and it's all anecdotal, but when I hear at the greater level what happens sometimes, it's like what I did see in your clips was the struggles from people who come from regions of Quebec far from Montreal, and I never ever thought about them. But within the city, I find it like it's almost like a tale of multiple cities at this point, depending on where you are on an age curve relative to the divisiveness.
Well, you raised a really good point, which is one that has come up again and again during the screenings, that there is this revival of a notion that Quebec has to be French, not in the sense of Bill 101, which is we want to have French as the public language. We have to be French in the sense that that's the only language we're going to speak. So, and what we see is that Anglos over the last 50 years have become bilingual. You know, they have no trouble speaking French, whatever. Allophones, and if anybody's outside of Quebec doesn't know what an allophone is, it's an invented bureaucratic term for someone whose mother tongue is neither English nor French, it's other tongue. Allophones, unlike the old days when they would totally integrate or assimilate, they retain their mother tongue. They learn French, often because of Bill 101, they have to go to French schools, but they also learn English. And then, as Holden says, more and more, I mean, my kids are about your age, Holden, so I saw them go through high school. They went to French school when their friends were militantly anti-Anglo, and then they went to university, and then they traveled, and they all, you know, learned English and learned other languages, and everything changed for them. So if we were to have a referendum tomorrow, not about is French threatened in Quebec, you know, is there a vulnerability to French in Quebec? I mean, that will always be a factor. That'll always be a source of
insecurity.
If we were to ask the question, do you want a society that is multilingual, that is open on the world, or do you want a society that is unilingual, unicultural, and just closed in on itself? It would be a landslide, and maybe we could put this whole thing behind us and move on to something more productive. You know, that's my dream for the next 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, I see
it with the young people. And I, in general, people, especially under the age of 25, who just grew up with TikTok, like, they all speak English because all the good content's in English, and it's just how it is. Like,
did you see the news today about the junior hockey league? The kids in the locker room have these big motivational slogans in English, and they have to take them out because in Quebec you cannot have language in English. And the kids are going, "Come on, it's more fun, it's punchy. We speak French. It's not going to change our French," and they can all speak English. I mean, I live in Outremont, which is supposed to be the most French part of Montreal. It's actually the most bilingual part. Everybody switches back and forth. You know, there's no problem about it.
Yeah. I agree with Guy. You talk about that in your film, about how there's like two visions of Quebec. One based on, you know, the necessity of establishing French as common language of communication and business, but within a multilingual, a multicultural, cosmopolitan context. And then there's like this other kind of like mindset of like, oh no, what we need to do is we need to reinforce not just French the language, but this Quebecois culture, this Quebecois language, Quebecois values. And I have a really tough time with that because to me, that's identity politics. That's ethnocentric politics. And that's extremely dangerous. And I really don't think it respects the history of Quebec and specifically Montreal. And I think that it's very narrow in vision, and I don't think it represents, as you said, the general sentiment of the population as a whole.
Well, the data that has been used to justify the language legislation is based on things like language spoken at home, mother tongue, language at work, not whether people can speak French and do French. I mean, on my film at the end, I had about 20 young people work on the film, and they all came from different roots. They all speak their mother tongue, they speak French, they speak English. Many of them arrived in Quebec with a different mother tongue. In fact, the guy who was the DOP and the editor speaks excellent French. He prides himself on speaking French better than most other people who speak French.
Yeah.
But according to the language laws, the fact that his mother tongue is not French, he's a threat to Quebec. I'm a threat to Quebec because it's not my mother tongue. You guys are threats to Quebec. And it doesn't matter how well people speak French. So it's this.
Yeah, but we're not threats. We are Quebec. You see, this is the big thing.
We should be friends, allies, assets, anything but threats.
Yeah, and that's the unfortunate part of politics in Quebec.
Brings up an interesting point there, because something that I find, because I do Uber driving now, so I get this influx of random strangers in my car, and frequently people question where I'm from because of my accent, and I'm like, Montreal. I'm a Quebecer.
You're sure it's not the hat?
Man, it's a Montreal brand, bro. I'm just telling you. I'm just repping the city with the grimy.
It's a joke, Holden.
But something I've realized, like for me, like if like I identify as a Quebecer, or I'm cool Quebecois too, whatever. Like I feel more Quebecer than I feel Canadian, because when I go to other parts of Canada, I don't really understand the culture because I grew up in Quebec and I grew up with Quebec culture, and it is a distinct culture. Despite it isn't language centric. It is a distinct culture. That's how I see it. Like, we are different than Ontarians. We are different than the East Coast. We are not the same as BC, as just like a group of people. But that's where like a lot of people get confused that I, as an English person, would identify as a Quebecer, because it's almost like a frowned upon thing, despite the fact that, despite Alex's disdain of identity politics, the world likes identity politics because it helps us define ourselves and, fit into the bigger picture. That's why people love their ethnicities. That's why it's such an important factor. So it is important to identify Quebec as a distinct ethnic group of people. However, it's also important to recognize that Quebec is a population that grows on immigration, and that we shouldn't be ashamed of that. And both these things can be true at once.
That's a great point. He mentioned the word shame, and I'm when watching your film, some of the interviewers talked about this shame, this like the other, like how do I prove myself as like a valid Quebecer or Montrealer, right?
Or also speaking French with an accent. That makes
I'm tired of it. I don't want to be. I don't want to feel shameful anymore. I want to be proud of who I am. I should be proud of who we are. We all should be proud of who we are. And it's like I don't want to engage in this, like have this guilt trip. And I really don't have much patience for like when I'm speaking French to Quebecois and a Quebecois pulls like, oh, your French could be so much better. Well, my French is what it is.
Does that happen to you a lot?
Yeah, it happens to me. And if you want my French to be better, right, maybe we should talk more in French together. You shouldn't give me a hard time about it. So, it does happen. I've had it happen.
I mean, Holden, when I launched the film,
again, I'm not being facetious. I just have the opposite experience. Maybe my French is just good and I'm misconstrued or something, but I get wild compliments for my French.
Well,
all these Quebecers I meet.
Well, I for the most part, yeah. Now, people. I deal business with Quebec, the French Quebecois on a daily basis. I'm in the construction business. I never have bad experiences in that sense, but it's out there. And, what happens is that because I feel, correct me if I'm wrong, Guy or Holden, I feel what happens is that the political narrative that day emboldens like how do you say the xenophobes, the
nitpicking xenophobes.
Yeah, it's just like that. I really get that impression, right? I sense that, right? Or you hear Legault or a CAC representative saying, "Oh, the immigrants come to Quebec and they go to English and they don't. I mean, they go to Montreal and they don't learn how to speak French." And I'm like, excuse me. It's like really what stupidities, obviously you're completely detached
Based
with
on what data?
yeah,
Nothing
you're
supports
detached
that.
from the reality in Montreal,
Yeah.
and I think my identity now is really, I've become more of a Montreal than anything else. And I saw that someone talking about that in your film, and I really connected with that person. I really see, I had to leave the province because I couldn't find employment because I was, when you talk to the figures, and Holden, this is before your time, and
Right.
when you were back in the 80s and 90s, if you were an Anglophone who knew how to speak French, your French could never be good enough for a lot of the positions out there. And someone was talking in the interview. You got to see this film, people. It's amazing. There's a woman talking in the
What
film
we
about
choose to remember.
yeah, what we choose to remember. And she's talking about how, she was making applications. She would never get called back from Quebec Inc. It would always be multinational
Right.
corporations. She never got
Mm.
an interview. And I remember that someone pulled an experiment. They sent out a resume exactly the same thing and had a very French Canadian name, and they got tons of callbacks. And they sent out other invitations under an Arab name, an Italian name, and they got nothing, right? So it's out there, it exists. And you see that even
That's
in the
fair.
city of Montreal, right? You see that in Côte-des-Neiges and Iji. When you go to council, you go there, and all the directors, all the top civil servants, they first of all, they don't live here, and they don't reflect us, right? It's like
Right.
it's almost like we're like colonized. And you talk about this idea of the run it by me again, the oppressor. It's hard for the oppressor that
Well, one of the women in the film
yeah,
says that this myth about the francophones being oppressed in Quebec, as if they're the only people oppressed.
right,
And a number of the people in the film who arrived during that post-war period, when it was tough, it was tough to
right.
find work. It was tough to fit in. There was no government support. So
Mhm.
everybody struggled to survive. Everybody struggled to get respect. And so one woman says that she thinks of that myth of the francophone as the oppressed, as the only oppressed in the society, is problematic because when you're so busy seeing yourself as the oppressed, you can't see yourself as the oppressor.
Right.
Mm.
Which is not to say that the francophones are oppressors, but in some cases they are clearly the majority,
No,
and they control
they
things
can.
that cause negative impacts on minorities. So they create oppressive situations, whether or not they want to claim it or feel responsible for it. And she points it out quite clearly that when you're constantly saying, I mean, let me give you an example of a francophone good friend of mine who saw the film and liked the film, most of the film, liked the film. But he said, my family, the British Army marched in, they burnt our houses, they stole our country, they oppressed us. And he says, I just can't help feeling annoyed when after all of the things we've suffered, these people are complaining about not finding a job. And I'm thinking, well,
What are they supposed to complain about?
they probably don't know what happened
That's
250
their
years ago.
reality.
You actually don't know what happened to it.
That's a big guilt trip again.
So
But
it's like at some point you have to let go of the past and you have to
What
deal with
do I
present.
have to do with the
but just to
English who
add
came
to
here and
what
conquered it? This is I don't have any
Yeah.
connection, any link
it's
with that.
ironic. It's such an ironic line of thinking in the bigger conversation of life. But I think what's like just to add to what you're saying, like look at the conversation of systemic racism in Quebec. I mean, Legault. Meanwhile, just recently, a famous Quebec actor posted an N-word joke publicly on his Instagram, and that's a viral story that's happening. That, like, how could that be? How could one of your mainstream stars be so flagrantly racist and have the amount of defense that he's getting from these Quebecois folk? And that is being the oppressor, to defend a racist action for the sake of humor, which sometimes I've seen happen. I've seen it happen a lot on Facebook. People just think it's okay because culturally it might be, but to the group of people being attacked, it is absolutely not okay. And it is reinforced by our authorities. Thus, they do act as oppressors when things go against what they want. There is subjugation. Like, I don't go to as extreme lengths now, but I spent a lot of my life calling our government fascist in its behavior because it kind of follows, like, don't get me wrong, I am not pro-Quebec in terms of its political stances and stuff. I just find that there's a disparity between what the Quebec government puts out and my reality dealing with French people in Quebec.
Yeah, but Guy mentions that in his film, that there's really, when you deal with Quebecois on a one-to-one basis, it's really, they're very there's very, I'm half French, by the way. They're very friendly, open,
Welcoming, friendly.
generous.
Yeah.
You know, there's this, and when you make an effort to speak French to them, oh, this guy knows how to speak French, and I know how to swear in French. I make jokes, and I really get along with them. But then there's kind of this insecurity groupthink that happens at the the community level and at the government level that just kind of it poisons, I think, the how do you say, the social fabric, the tissue social of our culture, of our communities, and our environment. And it's really unfortunate. And I really feel that we're going through a very difficult time right now. We went through a massive exodus. I lived through that. Okay, I lived through that. I was a young man when the Parti Québécois came in power and implemented the first, laws to force the use of French in the workplace. As an Anglophone, I came to terms with that, like many Anglophones did. But I'm kind of an enigma, right? My mother's French, my father's Italian. I learned English, but when I went to elementary school, my mom dressed me up as a Quebecois boy, right? Quebecois fashions, and the Anglo students used to hit me because they wanted to see me say ayoy, and they hit me ayoy. That was my gut response, was to respond that way, right? And then I grew up, and then I became an Anglophone, and then I'd be berated by the Francophones. I'm just like, at the end of the day, I'm like, you know what? F all of you. I'm tired of this, right?
So my understanding listening to this is that there is a distinct difference being English, growing up in this province in the 80s and earlier, let's say, than it is growing up in the 90s and beyond. Because, like, I grew up in the 90s, and I feel
he talks about that in this film as well, how the different ways of immigration, the experience is different. And you mentioned something in the film, but we're giving all the film away. I'm like,
that's fine. People are still going to come.
There's plenty more in the film people can discover.
I'm telling you, you could give the entire plot away of the film right now, and it wouldn't change the impact. If anything, people would still want to go more. Like, the spoilers thing doesn't ruin people going to movies anymore.
Well, it's a community exercise, right? It's not just about film. It's about seeing the film and having a conversation. So go ahead.
Although I know some people who've seen the film 5 or 6 times and have come to more than one public screening.
See, we can spoil.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I say in the agenda, it says, can you watch it again and again and again? And the answer to that is a definitively yes, you can. And the conversations will always be different.
To that point, though, like, a lot of the experiences, it sounds like things were more confrontational in the past in a more overt way, is what I'm understanding. Whereas I feel like now it happens less frequently with the overt nature, and it's more of a subliminal thing that's taking place today.
Well, there's a couple of factors. One is that it was a lot more overt and violent and tribal. If you talk to people who grew up in the 50s, 60s, the Italian kids would beat up the Greek kids, who'd beat up the Portuguese kids, who'd beat up the Jewish
Everybody
kids.
was beating everybody up.
There was a lot of violence.
It's not happening like that now.
So it was kind of, you had to pick your tribe, and you tried to pick the one that could defend you the best in a street battle. And if you look back to Montreal in the early part of the 20th century, sometimes people would never leave their neighborhood, because you wouldn't go somewhere where you weren't known and you didn't have friends. I mean, people were very tribal and very communal. So for people of your generation, I mean, the idea of going anywhere in Montreal, talking to anybody, there's no feeling of like, do I dare cross this frontier and go into this neighborhood where nobody knows me? Will I be? But at the same time, there's this myth, which I bought into when I first came to Quebec, that Montreal was polarized between left and right, east and west along St. Lawrence Boulevard. The east side was entirely French, and the west side was entirely English, and that they never talked, and it was two solitudes. And when my kids were young, my wife, who's a Francophone, decided we were going to go live in Rosemount. So, I was like tiptoeing around Rosemount, thinking like I was the first Anglo who would ever set foot on that side of town. Well, at the time that I was born, there was 100,000 Anglos living in Rosemount. It was a third of the population. There was a huge Anglo population out in the East End near the refineries. I was interviewing Lise Ravary, a Francophone journalist, for a different documentary 2 years ago. She told me that when she grew up in Hochelaga in the 60s, there were English schools, English churches, English neighbors. So while there was this tribalism and aggressivity, there was also more distribution than there is sometimes now. People were more inclined to live side by side. So it's kind of a contradiction, but they're both facts apparently are true. And the idea that, which I talk about in the film, and I think it's very important, that Montreal and the west part of Montreal is Anglo territory, and maybe a bit of the townships. Not true at all.
No, it's not true.
Every region of Quebec had large Anglo populations, and again, it's not like we controlled it, we owned it, we deserved recognition. It was like these people helped build it. I was in Baie-Comeau a couple of years ago, and the guy who gave me the guided tour was a school friend of Brian Mulroney, who just died a few weeks ago. So this guy's fairly old, but very interesting. Came from Nova Scotia, learned French, speaks French like Mulroney, no accent, back and forth. He gives tours to visitors coming in on boat tours, and he shows them around Baie-Comeau. And one of the reactions from people from Quebec is, thank God we got all of those foreigners out of here, and we've reclaimed Baie-Comeau and it's ours. And he says, now wait a minute, those people, those foreigners, they'd spent their entire lives here building this place. McCormick came in a canoe and discovered Baie-Comeau, built it up, invested a personal fortune to build docks and refinery and house and church and schools. And if he hadn't done that, who would have done that? So instead of looking upon these people as being invaders and being happy that they're gone, there should be a sense of they helped build it, they contributed, they deserve to be remembered somewhere in the history of
collaborators. Yeah, and this is why there's some silliness about it, and it is a stick. I wear the Trainman, and I wear the CN garb because the rail was very much a collaborative endeavor by both the French and English to build this country, and it connected the country together. And a lot of people forget about that, right? It's like, the Irish, once again, the Chinese were involved in the laying of the rail. There was huge, massive rail industries in Montreal. My grandfather's grandparents, Jean-Guy Lapierre and Giuseppe Montagano, worked on the Lachine Canal, which was the birthplace of industrialization in Canada. They all worked together collectively. And yeah, there was discrimination. There's no doubt about that. Montreal, like you mentioned in your film, and I've also seen quite a bit of work done by Scott. Scott, please.
Scott McLeod.
Thank you.
Yes.
And he did quite a few pieces on Griffintown,
yeah.
and the terrible exploitive conditions that existed in Griffintown, but that wasn't unique to French. It was the Irish, the Italian. They all suffered that. I remember talking to my dad. I says, "Well, Dad, what was it like growing back in Ville-Émard in the day? What was your relationships with the French and the Poles and the other communities?" And he says, "Well, we're all the same. We're all being exploited collectively together, right? It's not we didn't have issues with them." And one of the things, though, that was interesting about him was that back in his day, you mentioned this in the film too, is that a lot of the immigrant communities weren't encouraged to go to the French Catholic schools. The Quebecois were very insular. They really kept to their community. And a lot of times, like my father, he went to English school, English Protestant school to get his education, or English. It was the English-Irish schools. And in fact, he told me, it wasn't the Protestant schools and the Irish schools and the Catholic schools that were fighting with each other. It was actually the Irish Catholic schools that were fighting with the French Catholic schools. There was more friction there. So our history is really it's dynamic. It's all over the place. It's really hard to package.
Well, I would just like to add on that point that when I've been screening the film, and there are many Francophones. I've had a lot of Francophones who are not from Quebec, Franco-Ontarians, Acadians, people from Haiti, the
Right.
Maghreb from Europe. And, they kind of identify with the immigrant story part. Even though they're mother tongue Francophones, there are challenges to immigrating to a new place and fitting in. So they identify with that.
Mhm.
But the whole question of language, of learning a language and mastering it. Oh, I just lost my thread here. We were talking about your uncle, your dad.
My father dealing with like the conflict.
Oh yeah. So when I show that piece of the film about the school system, so I have some fairly militant Quebec separatists who come to see the film.
Oh yeah,
Sometimes brought
how did
by
that go
scholars.
over? I'm really curious about that
And
actually.
they kind of arrive thinking, well, if you think that you're going to tell us that you suffered more than us, well, I'm going to set you straight. When they see the film and they realize that so many young people were rejected from the Catholic schools, particularly after the Second World War. It was less so before because there were smaller numbers. I mean, Italians were more likely to be accepted into the Catholic system before the Second World War than after. And when they realize that, I can see the penny drop and they go, oh, wow, like that was a serious unforced error. And they can perfectly understand how that could have happened, that the church said, we don't want foreigners, we don't want other religions, we don't want refugees. And there's a moment of sympathy, of opening, of possible dialogue that opens up at that moment. And especially in the context of, Jacques Parizeau's comments after the second referendum,
Right.
blaming the loss on money.
I saw that live, by the way.
Yeah, well, so did
I saw him mouth the words.
But
I said,
what's the comment?
I just said, I can't believe he just said that.
After the referendum, he was
L'argent,
years. He was
it is
angry,
that
upset.
Nick.
Alex,
And he
let him
said-
speak.
He said the referendum was lost because of money, big money buying it, scaring
Right.
people, and the ethnic vote who turned.
Yeah,
against
but
the
he didn't
Quebec.
say it like that. He said it.
L'argent et des voix ethniques.
He's like there was these that Nick. Yeah.
And so, but when you understand that these thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of young immigrants were actually rejected by the Catholic Church, which was also synonymous with French, put into the Protestant system, which was synonymous with English, and identified with that community and felt uncomfortable with the Quebec controlled by a Francophone majority. I mean, there was a serious misunderstanding, a serious political error that cost the second referendum. So when fair-minded Francophones, even the most militantly separatist, see the film, they go, oh yes, I hadn't thought about that, or it's never been brought to my attention, but that was a serious error on our part, and we have to own that.
Nah, thank you for raising that. So, this if you're watching this podcast, which I'm sure you are, the film is really kind of like it really gets a conversation going. As you can see, Guy and myself were just like getting at it because there's so much to talk about, and the film touches so many nerves in a good way and bad way. It's really, I think it really is a community conversation that needs to be had, and I think the film is a good centerpiece, is a good starting point for us to go in a variety of different directions. Holden, he talks too about the newer immigration and how they seem to be integrating better and they identify more as Quebecers.
Well, I wouldn't say that everyone in the newer immigration integrates better. I'm going to say that a lot of the younger people don't share the older biases and politicized
I hope not.
blindness because we're connected to the bigger world, and like there's almost nobody on earth that feels bad for Quebec except for Quebec. So if you come from like anywhere else or have any perspective at all of the world, it's super hard to feel bad for a place that has such good socialism as Quebec does, to be honest. And it's like if your biggest issues are language, it's preposterous and it creates real situations. But there's literal wars going on. Haiti's government just collapsed. There's some real shit happening. And I think that most people in the older generations didn't travel as much. Their exposure, because to me the biggest culprit's the media. And honestly, they're the ones who make money off this polarized divisiveness. You know, I think it's Le Devoir that just loves it. They just do what they can to.
I would say the
poke at it.
politicians. I think the
The
politicians.
politicians.
Maybe it's not Le Devoir. I don't know which one I'm thinking of.
Or
It's
the
one
Journal
of
de
them.
Montréal.
Journal de Montréal.
That's the one.
I think you're
So
talking
that's
about
what
the
I meant, because I
Journal.
realized Le Devoir is
The Montreal.
they're more legitimate. So like I'm not trying to, but like there are people that sensationalize it, and then people who's like, especially if your only news sources are like watching it on TV, and you're coming from a more traditional acquisition of news, you're a lot more susceptible to government propaganda and brainwashing than if you're out there kind of in a more independent news grind. And the independent news grind, you're way more susceptible to algorithms and being led down astray for other reasons. But it's not the same as watching government curated news in your face.
So I want to talk about, like, you know, what we choose to remember, the title of the film. And I think that's really poignant because we make choices, right? As a society, individually. And I think, though, individually, for us to understand our own family and our own personal history, that's an exercise, right? And I think it's important that we all partake in that exercise. And it's not always easy for people to do that, right? Because they lose connections. And I wanted to talk to you about that, the collective memory, and how that impacts our view of today, right? And most importantly, you know, when I studied history, one of the things that came up from my history professors was that, you know, the winners, you know, write the history, right? And we see that in Quebec a bit, you know, a bit of the whitewashing that goes on. You know, how they want to name the Griffintown Ren Station after Bernard Laundrie, stuff like that, right? So, shoot, I said a lot there.
Well, of course they do, because they have the power. And this is a serious problem in Quebec. I mean, let me give you an example of how the powerful rewrite history. About 30 years ago, Montreal created its first History of Montreal Museum, the Pointe-à-Calière Museum.
Yes, I've been there.
So when they built the museum, they were writing this large multimedia show. It was a 200-seat theater, and it was a multimedia projection, History of Montreal. So when they were building the theater, they didn't know what they were going to find. So the history was fairly generic. 10 years later, in 2000, they had discovered in the foundations of the building where the museum was, the first burial ground, the first fort, the first trading center. I mean, so all of these vestiges of the history were actually in the museum. Unlike other museums where you'd bring junk into a box, the box was built on top of the history. So I had the honor or the privilege of writing that second show, sort of recreating the history of Montreal, using within this room where we're projecting vestiges that you can actually see of these first burial, the first fort, etc. And I wanted to open the show with an indigenous group sort of in the distance. You could hear them muttering, talking, just the silhouettes. And then a second group a little bit further forward, in slightly sharper focus, talking a clearly different language, but they're talking, they're debating, they're bartering. And then a third group quite in focus. And the three of them are all talking and they're bartering and they're trading and they're going on silence. And they turn their heads and the French arrive. And I thought that was a brilliant, like, first scene that sets everything up. It's dramatic, it's powerful. I was working with a board of 30 content supervisors, you know, historians, ethnologists, and they all said, no, we can't do that because that would suggest that we took the land away from Indigenous people.
Yeah, but it's what they did.
And then I've got the historians around the table who wrote the history books, and I have copies of their books. And I'm saying, but you yourself say this was a trading land and all. Yes, but they were not resident here. They were nomadic. They didn't actually own it. They didn't take. So
right. Here comes the rationalization.
I was shocked. I was shocked by this egregious rewriting of history.
Right.
And we see that in our history classes. And I did a presentation of my film to a bunch of young students who are learning to be history teachers at McGill University a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
And the guy teaching them said, you can come and talk about your film, but frankly, I don't know if they're that interested in Quebec history. So I don't know if they'll be that interested in your film, but I'll give you half an hour. So given that warning, I came in and I said, so how many of you were educated in Quebec? And I was surprised that almost all of them were educated in Quebec, so not so many foreign students. And I said, how many of you enjoyed your history classes? Not so much. And then I said, how many of you felt that your family and your community was represented in the history you learned?
Mhm.
And they all looked around. One girl sort of put her finger up, and then she felt uncomfortable, and she said, well, my mother's Francophone. And I
Right.
said, so you're telling me that you only identified with the history you were taught through your mother, who's Francophone, that your
Right.
father, who's not Francophone, was neglected. And then everybody in the class kind of a penny dropped. And we had this wonderful conversation about how that history course needs to include us all in our histories.
And it
And
doesn't. Yeah, and I've been to Point Kayab Museum, and I can tell
Well,
you
if I'm not
something.
mistaken,
I'm
like
not impressed.
Quebec got in
I'm
big
not
trouble
impressed.
recently because they published a history book that neglected to mention women and people of color. This was in 2018, and they got ostracized heavy. And that's like just to let people know that it's like recent Quebec, and like that means that the history book I got was even better technically than the one the kids currently get, because I don't know if they ever changed that book, but yeah, Quebec Beyond one, and it does not include the whole world. It's the history of, remember, it was the history of Quebec and Canada in a nutshell, and the key part was Quebec, and everyone got that book, and it was propaganda.
Well, when my kids were going to school, they'd come home from history class and they'd say, you would not believe what they taught us today. You know, it's all about the Anglo oppressors. And so, yes, so to come back to your question, Alex, yes, the people who control the means of production, the means of communication, control the message. The history course has been deliberately written to tell one story at the expense of many, many other stories. And, you know, one of the purposes of my film is to expand that conversation. And the response from the Anglo and Allophone community has been extraordinary. But right now I have a publicist working with me trying to reach Francophone journalists and opinion makers, and it is much more resistant. You know,
I would
this
imagine.
idea,
I would
yeah,
imagine, because you're basically calling in question like the kind of like standard narrative that the province has been operating on, right? And then I think too what your film kind of like uh, it's like a brick wall to them in a sense, because there's this big effort. This is what I see, and it's subjective observation, okay, people, but it is what I see, and from what I read, there's this kind of like paranoia at the provincial level about Montreal and what it represents, and they want it to be what they want it to be. It's like, we want you to be like this. And I'm like, well, Montreal is what it is.
it totally is what it is. And we love it that
I
way.
like, I really have a tough time when you have like a government body come in and dictate what culture should be. Its culture is what it is. It's the people who are responsible for developing and creating that. And you always see these Quebec interventions into the cultural fabric of the city of Montreal to serve some sort of like what their image of it should be, to drive that and to push that narrative. And I'm at serious odds with it. I think I think it hurts all of us, right? It robs us of all our personal family histories, our own stories, our own histories. Because let's just own up to it, right? History, and Scott talks about this. History is stories, right? It's like the sharing of stories, right? But I am a student of politics, and what I can tell you is that it doesn't bode well for minorities in terms of like what's remembered. They're often forgotten, and I find that a little bizarre, because we supposedly still live within the country of Canada, and it's almost like the federal government is sort of like embraced, without really having a public conversation or public debate about it. They've embraced asymmetrical federalism, and they're allowing Quebec to dictate, right, their own identity, very much separate from the Canadian identity. We've seen a lot more of that, especially with the rise of what they call Quebec nationalism, and it scares me. I
I'm gonna
don't
just
see.
say that's not unique to Quebec, though. There's several
No.
provinces that are, because I don't know what when I hear, I'm not like I don't like the idea of a Canadian identity, because no one can agree on what that means or what it really represents, and there is no uniform singular Canadian identity outside of government policies. Like, we
Well,
got
that's
free
the Canadian
healthcare,
identity, right?
things.
It's like everybody is welcome. Everybody is
But that's
can live
not the
here.
shared Canadian experience. That's
Multiculturalism.
honestly,
That's what I was taught
that's
back in
not
elementary school. I
that's
don't know
but
about you
you're
there,
also
Guy.
coming from the more East Coast liberal side of it. But if you grow up in other provinces, you're not being taught the same thing as we're seeing with Western Canada's love of pure polyvé and other kinds of ideologies. Thus, I don't see the shared Canadian identity. I do see about 4 or 5 distinct cultural groups with separate identities that make up maybe 6 groups, if we count the territories, that make up distinct cultural groups that share a land called Canada. And honestly, the United States is made up the same way. The people in Cali and the people in New York live drastically different lives despite being part of the same federation. And I think if we're having an honest conversation, we need to not group everybody into this Canadian bucket, because what does that mean? Canadian pundits can't define it. Canadian politicians can't define it. It's not.
I can
just
define
left,
it.
left
Would
of
you like me to
America.
define
The
Canadian
best answer
identity?
I've ever seen is left of the States. that's
Yeah,
the best.
but this is also a part and parcel of the Canadian identity, is how we distinguish ourselves from the Americans, absolutely. But to me, in the classical sense, the Canadian identity was a country based on multiculturalism, respect for the law, and an openness and tolerance, and we included religious tolerance, right? A tolerance for people with different backgrounds. That was to me the ideal, and that was ideal of what Canada should be. And this an idea, or a national identity, excuse me, that was pushed by Pierre Trudeau himself and Joe Clark. Am I? Are you? I'm gonna ask you. I'm gonna ask Guy to jump in here because I'm talking. Go ahead. What do you think about this
Yeah, well,
conversation?
I think we can put this into a historical context that is fairly objective. Because
Mhm.
I hear what Holden is saying, and I agree with that. But there are some larger touchstones that we can refer to. The film goes back to my film goes back to the 70s, to the FLQ crisis.
Right.
When there
Right.
were hundreds of bombings, there was a lot of unrest in Quebec. 6 people were killed. It was quite frightening for a lot of folks.
Mhm.
Canadians were frightened. Quebecers were frightened. The governments of Montreal, Quebec, Ottawa were all frightened that it was going to turn into something much, much worse, because it's also in the context of the 60s of liberation movements in many parts of the world. There's an unlimited use of violence. So one response by Canada was to create the Official Languages Act, recognizing that French and English are 2 official languages, and that the French language needs to be protected and preserved. Now, that was a revolutionary statement. At the time, Quebec was not that interested in collaborating with the rest of Canada. Quebec just wanted to do its own thing, ideally to separate, did not want to renegotiate a deal with Canada that would appease the discrepancies and the injustices and put the separation agenda on the back burner. So the Official Languages Act became really focused on Francophones living across Canada, and they have benefited enormously from the Official Languages Act. And then eventually, the English-speaking community inside Quebec started benefiting as an official language community. That was not the initial intent. It was to defend French and English. Now, in the recent revision, we've come up to the 50th anniversary, and this is where it's important. Going back to first principles, Quebec said, this Official Languages Act is about us. We are the minority language in Quebec. So instead of saying, go away, keep your money, they're saying, it's our money. We want it. And Canada is saying, well, logically, you're right. That's why we created this act. And then there was a debate about, okay, we can justify supporting minority French communities within English Canada. We can justify supporting minority Quebec French society within English Canada. Where does the English minority within French Quebec fit into all of this? Nobody could figure it out. The Francophones within Quebec shouted it down Ottawa gave up. And so that's partly why we're in the situation where we feel that we've been abandoned by Canada, in the sense that our government in Ottawa really has washed its hands of us. So that is new. And we're still trying to figure out exactly what that means. And that has an implication on Bill 21, the language about religion and religious symbols, and Bill 96 about language, and the fact that the Quebec government used the notwithstanding clause to prevent any sort of court challenges before it was even tested.
Yeah, dangerous precedents, very dangerous. Yeah,
well, I had
find
a
it
conversation with a lawyer about this a few weeks ago, because when Pierre Trudeau repatriated the Constitution in '82, in all of the provinces felt like they were afraid of the other ones would gang up on them and go in some direction where they felt uncomfortable. So the notwithstanding clause was kind of a safety valve. So if Quebec says, we want to have our own tax collection, we can use the notwithstanding clause, we can do our own thing. So it was like protecting the provinces from the Confederation, because every province is different. What is new here and kind of frightening is that a couple of governments, mostly Quebec, are using the notwithstanding clause to oppress people within their own community, not to protect Quebecers from Canada, but for the majority of Quebecers to take away the rights of a minority. As far as I understand it, that was not the intent. That's not the way the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was not meant to be overridden at the expense of minorities. So we're in kind of new and treacherous territory here. Yeah. And I think people have good reason to feel concerned. The fact that Canada isn't really defending us, the Ottawa's not defending us. Yes. Quebec is using every tool in the toolbox to grab more power, more money, more control, more agenda, and the minorities within Quebec are going, well, wait a minute. Who's protecting us? If both the Quebec Charter of Rights and the Canadian Charter of Rights do not apply to us, then where do we go?
Yeah, no, I agree with you 100%.
Also, just to make it clear, the notwithstanding clause is a real thing baked into our Constitution of Rights, which does let the government ignore the Constitution of Rights, given they deem there's some level of emergency or crisis that lets them overturn it. It's similar to what Trudeau did with the Emergency Act that he instilled in Ottawa, which is, why would Trudeau want to limit the power if he's going to use similar power? Like, I don't think any of the governments are willing to give it up. I think they see this precedent as a way to move forward. Like, the Quebec government does a lot of foul things. Like, in somewhere around COVID, they passed a law that basically lets them take Indigenous land as long as it serves greater Quebec construction projects and infrastructure projects, to avoid what happened with the pipelines before COVID and how the Indigenous territories would pull up. Now they can just seize the land.
Okay, we're going way off topic.
It's kind of off topic, but it's also related, because it's the same government. It's just different in minority groups, and it's just different stories that we choose to remember. So, Alex, you shouldn't choose to seclude your memories to the things that you care about, and you should be open to the greater Quebec story that needs to be told.
Me bad. Okay, going on, because we're asking a lot of our audience right now, guys. Okay, so it's
that's what they're here for.
It's been an hour and 28 minutes, and if you're still listening,
you're the
I
only
love
one
you.
That
I really do.
The length of that. It's just you, Alex. You're the one that gets hungry. The rest of the audience.
That's
is
right. I do get hungry. It's not. I call it hangry. So, wow. We've talked a lot about a lot of stuff, and there's so much more to talk about. You know what I want to do, if you guys don't mind. There was a graph. I want to pull that up. Can we pull that up?
We can pull up your graph.
Yeah, that graph really says a lot, and I just want you. Okay, we're gonna end on this, and this is a teaser, okay, to all of you guys who are listening to this, and gals for that matter. About what the film is going to talk about, and I'm just going to let
the whole interview
Guy Rex Rodgers finish this interview by explaining this graph, and it's quite something. And go shoot.
So one of the guiding principles of the film is that I look at Bill 101, and there were very legitimate concerns in the 70s that were addressed by Bill 101. Two of them being disparity in wages for francophones, particularly unilingual francophones, and the inability to be served in French in many businesses. You know, that was the days of Eaton's, allegedly, when people were told that they would not serve anybody in languages other than English. So Bill 101 was setting out to ensure that everybody could be served in French and that there'd be wage parity based on language. So I showed the bars on the left of each of these categories at the beginning of the film. Now, this is towards the end of the film when I showed the comparative 1971 to 2011. And at this point in the film, we've showed that it's services available in French. I mean, that part of Bill 101 is resolved. And then I say, let's have a look at wage comparative wages in 2011. And this series of data was constructed by a guy named Francois Vaillancourt. In 1971, his data was explosive. The fact that if you look at the column on the left, unilingual francophones, they're the sort of basis point of 0%. So if you go 2 points over, in 1971, a unilingual Anglophone was earning 10% more than a unilingual Francophone, and a bilingual Anglophone was earning 17% more than a unilingual Francophone and more than a bilingual Francophone. So there were some serious disparities in terms of amount of money earned. By 2011, and these numbers still come from Francois Vaillancourt, so it's coming from the same guy using the same methodology, using the same Canada Census data, so they cannot be disputed as being tricked in any way. They're not Federalist numbers, they're not my numbers, they're made by the same guy who made the numbers in 1971. Right. So moving across the screen, considering that unilingual francophones are the base point, now bilingual francophones are earning just 7% more. So there's been a slight reduction there, a compression in the difference between francophones, unilingual, bilingual. Now, unilingual Anglophones are, instead of earning 10% more, are earning 10% less, which, I guess is not surprising after half a century of fighting for this equality. Bilingual Anglophones, now instead of earning 17% more than a unilingual Francophone, are earning 8% less.
That's shocking.
Well, that's kind of disturbing, but that's not shocking. It's when we get into the allophones it becomes shocking.
I always I'm aghast. I'm not shocked. I'm aghast with the allophone numbers.
So
that's
the
just crazy.
allophones who spoke English in 1971 earned the same as the unilingual Francophone. So they were sort of a second-class citizen. Instead of being improved, they're now earning, or at least at this point, they're earning 25% less than a unilingual Francophone. The French-speaking allophone, which you'd think would be earning more than an English-speaking allophone, are earning 36% less than a unilingual Francophone, 49% less than a bilingual Francophone. I mean, this is shocking. And an allophone who speaks both English and French is still earning 21% less than a unilingual Francophone. Now, these relatively small, at least now in hindsight, small discrepancies of 13% and 7% were shocking in the 70s. Now we're looking at numbers in the 20s and 30s. No one's talking about them.
Nobody's blinking an eye. Yeah.
Nobody's saying boo about them.
Yeah.
And this is scandalous.
I will say, in defense of the nobody, immigrants been talking about this my entire working life. This is not a new subject. It's just not popular in Caucasian communities in the greater population.
And it's funny, we had a gentleman on our last show last Tuesday, Michael Montague, who said that the racism today is worse than the racism it was before. Yeah. He actually said that, which I was shocked by that statement.
I find that disturbing. Yeah.
Yeah, and he actually said that.
Yeah.
So, okay, I
think a lot of it has to do with the fact that, as you described before, things were a lot more in your face and physically violent, we'll call it. Like, you could see it happening, whereas now it's systemically baked into a lot of institutions and laws where it's not as obvious because people don't behave so aggressively violent as they used to. They can point to those stats and ignore other things.
Yeah. It's I kind of compare the allophone anglophone experience in Quebec like a frog in a pot, and the water keeps on getting hotter and hotter and hotter. And, and before it realizes what's going on, it's already dead. It's already cooked alive.
Right.
So I'm sorry for that kind of dramatic ending to this interview. So I think we should bring this to a close, and I just want to thank you so much. First of all, Guy, for doing the movie. Really, the movie is. I think it's. I think it's going to be an incredibly important tool for the Anglophones and minorities. Just say minorities, because I get tired of these Anglophone, Francophone conversations. But just the minorities
Most
of Quebec.
people don't say allophone. They just say
English,
minority.
French.
It's a
Minority.
term.
Yeah. I just really think it's going to be this is going to be a great like kind of starting point for a conversation for the minority communities in Quebec. Bravo. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you for hosting the screening in NDP on the 25th. That's going to be great.
Yeah, and I encourage everybody to come out the 25th.
How do people get tickets?
They come to the Facebook event on Facebook.
Is it at the door, or is there an online link?
It's at the door. Don't be shy. Come. There's lots of room. Okay, and we have lots of space to accommodate all. And
there will be a lively conversation.
And there will be a lively Trainman will be there. Of course,
there's also food.
Yeah, there'll be food, popcorn, and pizza at the Legion. And the Legion is an important, community institution, and it is a good way for people to become familiar with it and know what the Legion's up to in the community.
And come early because they got mad limited parking.
Yeah, and
I'm just
take the metro.
Take the metro walk. And that's also a good idea. BMW it. Excuse me, did I muck that up or what?
You're ready for dinner. You're getting that phone.
And Alex just checked. Even though he should bring snacks at this point in his podcasting
I should have snacks. Again, I'm really very excited. If you want to help and promote the event, I'm always looking for people to help. And we have lots of promotional materials. We have invitations. We have posters. And I am so pleased. I felt very much alone in my mindset. But not only did I get to be introduced to Guy Rex Rodgers, who's has an enormous amount of intelligence and information to share with us, but there's the people that he features in this film are just like I feel infinity with them, kindred spirits. And I think that if we all come out and celebrate this collectively together, it'll make us feel good, first of all, which we need to do, be proud of who we are, celebrate who we are, and most importantly, share our stories. Each one of us has stories to tell, and we should tell them. Because if we don't, we'll forget, right? Right?
It's amazing how interesting people's stories are and how complex and how different. I mean, I'm fascinated every time I hear people get up and talk about their experience.
I couldn't agree more.
I mean, just one example is that there's a woman in the film whose grandfather was killed at the age, and her great grandfather was killed in a factory fire, and her grandfather became the man of the family at the age of 12. It's pretty remarkable. That would never happen nowadays.
Right? No, it would never happen.
I had a guy who came to the screening at Concordia a few weeks ago. His grandfather was orphaned and became the man of the family at the age of 8. 8. He was the eldest child, and he looked after his younger siblings.
Imagine the pressure on his shoulders.
People realized that child labor was allowed in our grandparents'
Well, there was no social support. If you didn't have a family, you starved. That was
you sink or swim. That was the way it was back in those days, right?
Whereas now it's mad illegal to hire an 8-year-old to go work. And
that's a good thing. We don't want 8-year-olds
working. We don't.
No, I'm not advocating that.
But they can still put their dishes in the dishwasher.
Pick up their clothes.
That's right. Clean up the rooms. And okay, I think we should end this.
Appreciate everyone who watched the episode and contributed.
Thank you so much.
We appreciate you coming through. Make sure to tell your friends and to go out there and share the word that you think. Well, you should go to Cult Montreal and go to their poll of the best of and tell everybody that the Trainman Report is your favorite 2023 podcast, because we started
gotta celebrate our own people, right?
End of 2023, and we would appreciate that.
We are the only NDG podcast.
I don't think that's true at all, to be honest with you. I mean, I have another NDG based podcast. So if
Oh
you're not
my
the-
God. You cheating.
saying.
Divided interest.
No, I'm saying
You
we're the only
pickle hating cheater.
We're taking up where NDG winning or whatever they were called left off and trying to fill the
Right.
void of being a news centric NDG based podcast about NDG.
Opinionated.
But to that point, there are other NDG podcasts that you should support, and you should support local media, because a lot of people whine about a lack of English media but put $0 behind independent art. And so, like, Guy got funding for it, but a lot of people have ideas and can't get no funding, and it's complicated to get funding, and you often need experience to get funding. So when you come across that amateur hour stuff, support it. Go throw a few dollars. If you got $1, sign up on their Patreon. You can afford $12 a year, things like that, and it would make a huge difference. And then also support us. And I'm trying to get Alex on board with how to capitalize our endeavors, because the content marketing game is just dark and dirty, but it is what it is. So we appreciate you all helping us get the engagement game up with the comments, the likes, the subscribes, the follows, and all that good stuff. Appreciate you here being with us. We'll be back next Tuesday, 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, live with more content, more NDG people, and all that good stuff. So live long and prosper, everyone out there.
Thank you, gentlemen.